Nicomachus moved through the palace corridors of Pella with the particular quietness of someone who had learned to look before acting, to measure before concluding. He was the court physician to King Amyntas, the second of Macedonia, and his days were organized around the body, its temperatures and its rhythms, the color that came into a patient's face when a crisis was passing, the way a fever moved through a household like weather. He kept notes. He asked questions of the body that the body could not answer in words, and so answered in other ways, through the evidence it left in skin and pulse, and the slow geography of illness and recovery. His son watched all of this from the edges of rooms. The boy was named Aristotle. He was born around 384 BCE in Stagira, a small coastal town on the Chalcidice Peninsula in the northern reaches of the Greek world, far from Athens, far from the philosophical prestige of the south, but close to the Aegean and its tides, close to the smell of salt and the particular textures of the natural world at the water's edge. He grew up in a household shaped by medicine, by observation, by the habit of looking at living things with careful eyes and asking what was actually there. These are not small inheritances. The way a child's earliest education and attention works on the mind is quiet and almost invisible, while it is happening, like water finding the shape of what it moves through. Nicomachus died while Aristotle was still young. The exact year is not recorded with certainty, but the boy was old enough to remember his father's manner at work and young enough to be left without him for most of his education. A guardian named Proxenus took responsibility for the child, arranged for his upbringing, and eventually, when Aristotle was around 17 years old, arranged for him to travel south to Athens to study at the academy, which Plato had established as a center of philosophical inquiry some 20 years before. Aristotle packed what a 17-year-old carries when traveling far from everything familiar, which is to say not very much, and set out for a city he had not seen. The Athens that received him in those years, around 367 BCE, was a place whose cultural and philosophical reputation had long since outgrown its declining political power. The city had lost its empire. Its influence in the wider Greek world was contested and diminishing, but the academy stood, and Plato was there, and the prestige of both was enormous. A young man arriving from Macedonia, a region many Athenians regarded as provincial, barely Greek in the full cultural sense, carried a particular kind of invisible weight, the expectation of having something to prove, the sharp attention of an outsider in a room designed for insiders. Aristotle entered that room and stayed for 20 years. 20 years is a long time to study with a single teacher. It is long enough to absorb a philosophical tradition so thoroughly that it begins to feel like the structure of thought itself, like the grammar of how questions are asked, rather than like a set of conclusions one happens to hold. It is also long enough, perhaps only long enough, to see clearly where the tradition one has absorbed does not reach, where the questions it asks are not the questions one finds oneself returning to, where the answers it offers leave something important unaccounted for. Aristotle absorbed Plato. He learned the dialogues, followed the arguments, sat in lectures, participated in the life of a philosophical community that organized itself around serious inquiry as a daily practice. And slowly, he came to disagree. Plato's great philosophical inheritance was his theory of forms, the visible world of ordinary experience, this stone, this tree, this particular act of courage in this particular moment, was, in Plato's account, only partially real. Behind it, beyond it, underlying it, there existed a realm of eternal, unchanging, perfect abstractions, the form of stone, the form of tree, the form of courage itself. These forms were more real than anything one could see or touch, because they did not change, did not decay, did not depend on anything outside themselves for their existence. The philosopher's task was to turn away from the flickering shadows of the visible world and ascend toward the light of these eternal truths. Knowledge was a form of recollection, the soul remembering what it had known before it became entangled in a body. This is a vision of extraordinary power and genuine beauty, and Aristotle spent 20 years inside it. But Aristotle was the son of a physician. He had grown up watching someone pay close, patient, respectful attention to the particular, to this patient's particular fever, this body's particular response to this remedy, the actual evidence in front of him, rather than the ideal condition one hoped to find. Plato looked upward. Aristotle looked down, not in a spirit of refusal, not with the sharpness of rejection, but with the steadiness of someone who cannot quite stop attending to what is actually in front of him, who finds in the particular a richness and a reality that the abstract cannot fully contain. The academy in those years was not a quiet place of individual contemplation. It was an active research community, a place of argument and dialogue and the sustained mutual testing of ideas, organized around the conviction that the philosophical life, the life of inquiry, was among the highest things a human being could pursue. Plato walked and talked. His students walked with him. The physical act of walking through the academy's grounds, moving through the afternoon light of Athens, the olive trees and the colonnaded spaces, was not incidental to the philosophy. It was part of how the philosophy happened, the rhythm of motion and thought woven together into a single practice. Aristotle walked those paths for 2 decades. He knew their length. He knew where the shadows fell at different times of year, and all the while he watched. He asked questions that arrived from a different angle than the questions Plato preferred. When Plato wanted to rise above the particulars to the universal form that accounted for them, Aristotle wanted to stay with the particulars and find the universal inside them rather than above them. When Plato sought what was eternal and unchanging, Aristotle kept being drawn back to what was living and moving and engaged in the constant process of being itself. These were not merely methodological disagreements, and the differences in where the two men looked when they wanted to understand something, differences in what they found interesting, differences in the shape of their philosophical attention, and these, in the end, are some of the deepest kinds of differences a person can carry. In the early 340 SBCE, before Plato's death, Aristotle left Athens for a period and traveled through the Aegean world. He spent time on the island of Lesbos, where a former student and friend named Theophrastus had connections. What he did there became one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of careful observation. On the shores of the lagoon at Pyrrha, in the tidal shallows where the sea met the land in shallow, light-filled water, Aristotle spent sustained time observing marine life. He watched fish. He examined crustaceans. He dissected cephalopods. He recorded what he saw with a patience that did not reach for metaphysical explanation, but stayed quietly with what was there. The descriptions he produced of the sea urchin's feeding apparatus, which later scientists would name Aristotle's lantern in his honor, are accurate in their essential features. The observations he made about the development of the embryos of dogfish sharks were not substantially corrected until the 19th century. These are not the results of a philosopher who treated natural observation as a preliminary step toward getting away from nature, toward abstract truth. They are the results of someone who found nature genuinely interesting in its own right, who could look at the actual structure of a living creature and find in that structure something worthy of sustained, serious, philosophical attention. This was, in its way, a direct argument against everything the theory of forms implied about where understanding was to be found. Back in the Lyceum, after he had established his own school in Athens in 335 BCE, these natural specimens became part of a shared research collection. There were pressed plants and preserved anatomical structures, drawings and notes, the accumulated evidence of many kinds of careful looking, gathered into a space that functioned both as a library and as a kind of philosophical argument made physical. The argument was that understanding begins here with what is actually in front of you, the shell, the bone, the careful pressed leaf, and that any philosophy that begins by turning away from these things has turned away from the very material in which understanding must eventually take root. The founding of the Lyceum in 335 BCE was not simply the establishment of a new institution, it was the institutionalization of a new idea about what philosophy was large enough to include. Under Plato, the academy was primarily concerned with mathematics, dialectic, and the inquiry into eternal forms, the transcendent and the unchanging. The Lyceum, as Aristotle organized it, encompassed biology and zoology, logic and rhetoric, ethics and politics, aesthetics and meteorology, the nature of the soul, and the mechanics of memory. Philosophy, in Aristotle's hands, grew to include nearly everything one could think carefully about, and the criterion for inclusion was not whether the subject pointed toward the eternal, but whether it was possible to think rigorously about it at all. This was a decisive transformation in the scope of what serious inquiry was understood to require. The colonnaded walkways of the Lyceum in morning light must have been a particular kind of place. Aristotle reportedly lectured while walking, and his school became known as the Peripatetic School, from peripatein, to walk around, because of this practice. His students moved alongside him through the grove that surrounded the Lyceum, sacred to Apollo, and the thinking happened in that rhythm of unhurried motion. This is not a trivial detail. The philosophical tradition that Aristotle established was one in which the body's movement and the mind's movement were not opposed, in which thinking was not something you did by sitting still and abstracting away from the physical world, but something you did while inhabiting it, while moving through it, while remaining in contact with the ground beneath your feet. The 4th century BCE was not a stable time in the Greek world. The city-states that had organized Greek political life for centuries were in serious decline. Athens had never fully recovered from its defeat in the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE. Sparta had risen and declined. Thebes had risen and declined. The small, particular political units that Greeks had long associated with the best conditions for civic life were being pressed from the north by Macedonia, the kingdom where Aristotle had grown up, and whose power was now under Philip II, and then his son Alexander, expanding in ways that would eventually remake the entire eastern Mediterranean world. Aristotle was, in a strange and not entirely comfortable way, connected to all of this. He had been engaged by Philip of Macedonia to serve as tutor to the young Alexander, and he did so for several years, though what passed between the philosopher and the future conqueror in those sessions is only partially recoverable from what the sources record. The political turbulence around him was not background noise to Aristotle's philosophical work. It was one of the pressures that made his ethical questions urgent in a way they might not have been in a more settled time. What does it mean to live well? What kind of community makes human flourishing possible? What virtues does a person need to navigate a world where the old institutions are under pressure and the new ones have not yet established their character? These questions for Aristotle were not purely theoretical. They were questions that the actual conditions of 4th century Greek life made pressing in concrete, practical terms. The philosophy and the historical moment pressed against each other, and what emerged from that pressure was a body of ethical and political thought, deeply shaped by the sense that these questions matter because they touch something real in how lives are actually lived. Plato died in 347 BCE. Aristotle was by then 37 years old, no longer young, long past the student phase, well into the years when a philosopher has had time to settle into the shape of his own thinking. The death of the teacher did not leave the student unchanged, but the change it produced was not the change of bereavement alone. It was also the change of a philosopher who had spent 20 years inside another person's philosophical world, and who now had to reckon fully and honestly with the distance between that world and his own. After Plato's death, Aristotle did not remain in Athens. The academy had existed under Plato's leadership for decades, and the question of who would succeed him was not one that resolved in Aristotle's favor. The succession went to Plato's nephew Speusippus, and Aristotle, for reasons that combined the personal with the political, left. He traveled to Assos on the coast of Asia Minor, where a former member of the academy named Hermias had established a small court and had invited Aristotle to participate in the philosophical community he was building. Aristotle went. He spent 3 years there, working and thinking and teaching. He married Pythias, the niece or adopted daughter of Hermias. He continued his biological observations. He carried his notes and his questions with him through the Aegean world, not as a man in exile, but as a man working out, in motion, what the next phase of his philosophical life would hold. What does it mean to leave a tradition? This is not a simple question. A person who has spent 20 years inside a way of thinking cannot simply walk away from it as though it had never happened. The tradition is part of how they think, part of how they ask questions, even when the questions they ask are no longer the tradition's own questions. Aristotle carried Plato with him everywhere he went. After 347 BCE, the theory of forms was present in his thinking as the position he was most carefully working against, the view whose strengths he understood because he had spent 2 decades with its best version, and whose limitations he could see precisely because he had been so thoroughly inside it. This is a different relationship to disagreement than simple rejection. It is the relationship of someone who has followed an argument as far as it goes and found honestly where it stops going, and who carries that limit as one of the most important things they know. The choice to follow one's own thinking, when it diverges from the tradition that formed it, is not an act of ingratitude. It is, in a particular philosophical sense, the fulfillment of what good education is for. Plato taught Aristotle to think carefully, to follow arguments wherever they led, to take questions seriously enough to stay with them beyond the point of comfort. When Aristotle did all of these things and arrived somewhere Plato had not arrived, he was not betraying his education. He was enacting it. The divergence was the proof that the formation had worked. A student who simply reproduced the teacher's conclusions had learned to repeat. A student who used the teacher's methods to find new ground had learned to think. Aristotle moved through the Aegean world in the years after Plato's death, carrying something that had no name yet, the shape of a philosophy that would eventually fill dozens of treatises, that would organize the inquiry into logic and ethics and biology and the nature of the soul into a single coherent way of engaging with what is real. He did not know the full shape of it yet. No one building something of that scale knows the full shape of it while they are building it. What he carried was a direction, downward, toward the particular, toward the natural world, toward the things that are actually here and living and changing, and toward the conviction that the earth beneath his feet was not a shadow of something above it, but the very place where understanding had to find its ground. There is something in this direction that deserves to be noticed. The philosopher who insists on attending to the particular, who refuses to let the abstract float free of the concrete, who keeps coming back to the actual texture of living things. This philosopher is making a claim about where reality is located, not above the visible world, not behind it, here in it, expressed through its changing forms with a depth and a complexity that patient attention can begin, slowly to trace, to look carefully at what is actually in front of you, without immediately reaching for a more elevated frame. This is not a lesser kind of thinking. It is a discipline of its own, requiring the same sustained seriousness as any other philosophical practice, and in some ways requiring more of it, because the visible world does not reward careless looking. The notes Aristotle carried with him from Lesbos, observations of tidal creatures, sketches of internal structures, records of what he had seen in the shallows, were not supplementary material for a philosophy that would eventually transcend them. They were philosophy. They were the practice of inquiry, finding its subject in the world as it was actually constituted, rather than as it would have to be in order to fit a prior theory. This is the disposition Nicomachus had practiced in the palace corridors of Pella, moving through his day with careful, patient eyes, attending to what the body was actually doing, rather than to what it ought to be doing in an ideal condition. The son had inherited the father's kind of attention, and had followed it all the way to the foundations of what it meant to understand anything at all. The Lyceum would not be founded for another decade after Plato's death. The great treatises on ethics and biology and the structure of logical argument would not reach their final form for years beyond that. But the philosophical disposition that made all of them possible was already fully present in the young man who had arrived at the gates of Athens at 17, carrying the expectations of a guardian and the observational habits of a father who was no longer alive to see what they would eventually produce. It was present in the student who had spent 20 years attending to Plato's arguments with enough genuine respect to follow them carefully, and enough honest attention to see where they failed to satisfy what he had actually seen. It was present in the traveler who moved through the Aegean world after his teacher's death, carrying his notes and his questions and his careful, grounded way of looking at whatever was actually there. Departure, when it comes after genuine formation, is not a severing. It is an extension, moving in a direction the origin could not have predicted, but could not have made possible without itself. Aristotle left the Academy in 347 BCE and moved outward through the islands and the coasts of the Aegean, and the philosophy he was carrying was already, in its essential direction, his own, not because he had rejected what Plato had given him, because he had taken it seriously enough to follow it past the point where the forms were enough, past the point where looking upward and away from the visible world satisfied what he needed to understand, all the way down to the shallows of a Lesbian lagoon, where the actual creatures of the actual world moved through clear water, waiting for someone with enough patience and enough respect for the particular to look at them honestly and write down what he saw. The gates of Athens had received him young. The Aegean world received him in the middle of his life, already shaped, already divergent, already moving toward the philosophy that would define the next decade of his work, and in ways no one in the 4th century BCE could have anticipated, a very great deal of what came after. He went with his notes, he went with his questions, he went with the conviction, already settled into something like a philosophical foundation, that whatever was true about the good life, about the nature of the soul, about the structure of living things, and the conditions under which they flourished, it was to be found in what was actually here, in the careful, patient, unhurried attention brought to what the world was actually doing, rather than in any realm above or behind or more permanent than the one in which everything living was quietly, continuously at work. In a room in Athens, in the 4th century before the Common Era, a student traces 2 letters across a papyrus with a careful finger. The letters are small and dry. They are the beginning of a word the student has heard spoken in lecture, but has not yet held quietly enough in private to understand. The first part of the word is eu. It means something like well, or good, or according to its nature. The second part is daimon. It means something older and harder to carry across languages, a guiding spirit, an inner genius, something like the particular force that animates a specific life from within rather than pressing on it from outside. Together, in the mouth of a careful speaker, they make eudaimonia. The student traces them again. The word does not mean happiness. Not yet. Not in the way the tracing has always assumed happiness to mean. The student sets the stylus down on the table. Outside, Athens is loud with its ordinary business. A city this old carries its noise with it, the way old wood carries the sounds of settling, familiar, unremarkable, a sound that does not interrupt anything. And yet inside this room, something quiet has just begun to shift. The word the student has been tracing is not pointing toward pleasure, not toward achievement, not toward the particular sensation a person chases through a good meal, or a successful negotiation, or the recognition of a crowd. It is pointing towards something slower, something more like weather than like event. Aristotle had been watching this kind of confusion for years before he wrote the Nicomachean Ethics. He had watched students arrive at the academy, expecting philosophy to give them the name of the thing they were already reaching for, and he had watched them leave with a slightly different problem than the one they came in with. He understood that the word happiness, as most people used it, described a feeling, a warmth, an ease, a sense of things having gone well in the particular afternoon where the feeling lived. And he was not against any of that. He was not trying to take the feeling away, but he had noticed something the word could not quite contain. He had noticed that some people felt very warm indeed, and were not, by any serious account, living well. And he had noticed that some people were living with a depth and a care and a constancy that the word happiness, in its ordinary usage, did not seem large enough to cover. The problem he sat down to address was this: what do we actually mean when we say that a life is going well? Not going comfortably, not going successfully, by the measurements other people use. Well, in the fullest sense of that word, in the sense that would still hold if you stripped away the admiration of neighbors and the accumulation of things and the particular warmth of Tuesday afternoons. He wanted to know what was left, and he thought the question was worth asking, not because the answer would be consoling, though it might be, but because understanding what the good life actually consists in is the necessary first move of anyone who wants to live one. He begins, in the Nicomachean Ethics, with a kind of quiet inventory. Every craft, he notes, every inquiry, every action seems to aim at some good. The archer at the target, the physician at health, the builder at the house. Goods nest inside one another. The sailor aims at a safe crossing. The safe crossing serves the merchant's purpose. The merchant's purpose serves something else again. And if this chain of purposes continues in every direction, then there must be something at the top of it, something toward which all the other goods are ordered, without itself being ordered toward anything further. something that is good not because it leads somewhere, but because it simply is where the leading was always going. He calls this the highest good, and he thinks it needs a name. The name he gives it is eudaimonia, but he is careful from the first paragraph about what this name is pointing at. He is not pointing at a feeling, he is not pointing at a state of affairs a person can achieve and then possess like a house deed. He is pointing at something more like an activity. The Greek word he reaches for is energeia, a continuous being at work, a kind of actuality that is different from mere potential, precisely because it is happening now, not waiting to happen. To be in a condition of eudaimonia is not to have arrived somewhere and sat down. It is to be at work in the particular way that is most fully human. It is something one does rather than something one has. This distinction matters more than it first appears. A person could have every capacity for virtue, every gift of character, every good habit carefully formed, every potential for generous and courageous and just engagement with the world, and still, if that capacity were never exercised, never brought into actual engagement with real people in real situations, that person would not be living well by Aristotle's account. The lyre player who never plays is not a musician. The generous person who never gives is not generous in any sense the world can verify or the soul can claim. Flourishing is not a private possession. It is always also a practice, and the practice is always happening in time, inside a specific life, with specific other people. In the room with the student tracing the word, the afternoon light has moved. The shadows in the corner of the room have shifted their angle. This is ordinary. It happens every afternoon. And yet, Aristotle's point about eudaimonia is something like the claim that this ordinary shifting of light, if attended to with full and honest engagement, contains more of what happiness actually names than most of the things people spend their lives chasing. Not because the light is magical, but because the attention is real, and the attention is the thing. He turns, in the early books of the ethics, to the candidates. What do people actually believe the highest good to be? He is thorough about this, the way a physician is thorough about differential diagnosis, not dismissing each option until it has been genuinely considered. The first candidate is pleasure. There are serious people, he notes, who hold that a life of pleasure is the best life. He does not mock them. He takes the position seriously enough to find exactly where it falls short. And where it falls short is here. Pleasure is a bloom. It appears on the surface of a life, and it is real, and it is good, and it belongs there. But it is not the root from which the life grows. The person who arranges their entire existence around the maximizing of pleasant experience has made the bloom the thing they are growing, and this, Aristotle thinks, is a confusion of two different orders of importance. The bloom follows when the roots are sound. It is present when the life is going well. But it is not what makes the life go well, any more than the warmth of a summer morning is what causes the season. The second candidate is honor, the recognition and admiration of other people. He is gentler with this one, perhaps because he can see why it is genuinely tempting. Honor does seem to track something real. The people whose company we admire, the ones we hold up as having lived well, tend to be people who have also been honored by those around them. There is a correlation, but Aristotle notices something careful. The correlation runs in the wrong direction for honor to be the highest good. Honor feels like a good life from the outside. It is the world's response to a good life. The person who has genuinely lived with courage and wisdom and care tends over time to receive the recognition that reflects that. But the person who merely receives recognition without the underlying reality is not eudaimon. They are performing eudaimonia for an audience, and the performance is not the thing itself. Besides, honor is contingent. It depends on the crowd, and a person's highest good cannot depend on whether the crowd is paying attention. The third candidate is wealth. He dispenses with this one almost gently, because the argument against it is so clean. Wealth is always a means. It is always useful for something else, for food, for shelter, for the education of children, for the resources that allow a person to exercise generosity. No one, in honest reflection, wants wealth for its own sake. They want what wealth allows, and this means wealth is, by structure, an instrumental good. It points beyond itself. The highest good, by definition, is the one that doesn't point beyond itself. It is where the pointing stops. Wealth cannot be that, because the moment you ask why wealth is good, the answer is always something further along. What Aristotle is doing here, through this careful elimination, is not merely clearing the field. He is helping the student in the room feel something, the particular sensation of removing the wrong answers, until what remains is strange and quiet and harder to argue with. The wrong answers are comfortable because they are familiar. Everyone understands what it means to want pleasure or honor or money. They are legible goals in the shared vocabulary of ambition. What Aristotle is left with, after the eliminations, is something less easy to point to and more difficult to accumulate or display. He calls it the activity of the soul, in accordance with reason. This phrase has confused readers for centuries, and the confusion is partly productive. He is not saying that the good life consists in thinking, in sitting very still, in doing mathematics. He is saying that the capacity that distinguishes human beings from the other animals is the capacity for rational activity, for action guided by understanding, for engagement with the world in which one's full reflective capacities are brought to bear. And to live the distinctively human life well is to exercise this capacity fully and consistently, in the way that a musician plays well, or a craftsman builds well, not mechanically, not by rule, but from a settled and trained relationship between the person and the activity. He calls this the function argument. It is one of the more careful arguments in the ethics, and it works like this. Every kind of thing has what he calls an ergon, its proper work or function. The eye's function is to see clearly. The knife's function is to cut cleanly. The flute player's function is to play well. In each case, the good of that thing is the thing doing its function excellently. And the question of what the good of a human being is requires first identifying what the distinctive function of a human being is, what it is that humans do that other things do not, or do not fully. Nutrition and growth are shared with plants. Sensation and appetite are shared with animals. What is distinctively human is the activity of the soul in accordance with rational principle, and the good for a human being, then, is this activity exercised in accordance with excellence, which is to say, in accordance with virtue. This is not a mechanical conclusion. It arrives with a kind of rightness that is different from proof. The student in the room, reading it for the first time, would not feel a problem had been solved. They would feel something had been recognized, something about the shape of a life they had already, without the words for it, been dimly aware of. Aristotle then makes a move that carries more weight than its simplicity suggests. He says that eudaimonia requires the whole of a life, not a moment of excellence, not a single afternoon when everything came together and the person acted with full grace and genuine courage and real generosity. A moment like that is real and good, but it is not enough. He reaches for an image. One swallow, he says, does not make a spring, and neither does one sunny day. The image is old and quiet and entirely right. It is the kind of image that philosophy sometimes produces when a thinker has found the exact shape of the thought they are trying to carry, when the metaphor is not decoration but precision. A single swallow is a real thing. It really did appear. It really did move through the air in that particular undulating motion that swallows have. It was genuinely present, but the season requires more than one of anything. The season is built from duration, from the slow accumulation of consistent returning, from the pattern that only becomes visible across weeks rather than in a single afternoon. And eudaimonia is like this. It is not an event, it is a season. It is something that characterizes a life across its varied landscape, across its good and difficult years alike, across the stretches of effort and the stretches of rest, through the times when virtue is easy and the times when it is not. This is where Aristotle differs most quietly and most durably from the ordinary understanding of happiness. The ordinary understanding reaches for a peak, the moment of greatest joy, the day everything aligned, the year nothing went wrong, and peaks are real. Aristotle does not deny them, but a peak is a summit, and a summit is a point, and a point has no duration. A life cannot be lived at a peak. The task of living takes place on lower ground, in ordinary weather, across thousands of unexceptional days that are not dramatic in any way that a later story could use. And eudaimonia, Aristotle's version of happiness, is what is happening in all of that ordinary ground, not what is saved for the summit. A student sitting with this argument for the first time might feel alongside its rightness something almost like relief, because most days are not peaks. Most days are exactly what they sound like, ordinary, sometimes tedious, sometimes quietly good, rarely dramatic in any direction. And if happiness is reserved for peaks, then most of a life is spent waiting for it. But if happiness is the quality of a life, being lived in accordance with its best capacities, consistently and attentively across all the ordinary days, then most of a life is, quietly and without announcement, already inside it. The argument about the whole life has another dimension that Aristotle develops carefully. He is aware that a life is vulnerable. He knows that good people face bad circumstances, that misfortune exists, that illness arrives, and cities fall, and the people one loves die. He is not a philosopher of pure inner self-sufficiency, the kind who would say that external conditions are entirely irrelevant to a life well lived. He acknowledges that a life of flourishing requires some minimum of material and social conditions, some basic health, some friendship, some civic context within which virtue can actually be exercised. And he acknowledges that catastrophic misfortune can damage a good life in ways that virtue alone cannot entirely repair. He does not pretend that happiness is invulnerable to the world, but he holds on to something careful amid all of this. He holds on to the claim that what distinguishes the person of genuine virtue from the person who merely had fortunate circumstances is precisely how the person of virtue inhabits their difficulty, not with the brittle cheerfulness that ignores it, but with the settled capacity to continue being who they are, even when the conditions are not good. The good person, he says, will never be made entirely miserable because they carry something in their character that misfortune cannot simply take. This is not a triumphant claim. It is a quiet one. It is the claim of someone who has looked honestly at how much the world can take and concluded that, even so, something remains. There is a scene that Aristotle's argument calls up, not explicitly, but by the pressure of its logic. Two people sitting side by side. One of them is enormously wealthy, admired, comfortable in their possessions, moving through the world with all the ease that accumulated resources provide. The other is materially modest, not destitute, but without the particular cushion that wealth supplies, and exercises, day after day, genuine courage in the small difficult things that require it, genuine care for the people around them, genuine honesty in the moments when dishonesty would be easier and no one would know. Aristotle's argument does not hesitate. It places all its weight on the second person, not because poverty is good, not because wealth is bad, but because the quality of a life, in the final assessment, is not a function of what it has accumulated, it is a function of what it has become. This is hard to hold because the first person is visible, their wealth announces itself. Their comfort is a legible signal that something has gone right. The second person's flourishing is quieter, less available for admiration, less easy to point to at a distance. But Aristotle is making a deeper claim that the legibility of a life and the quality of a life are different things, that what shows most easily from outside is not necessarily what matters most from inside, and that the entire practice of ethics is in part an education in learning to see the second kind of value clearly. He stays with the question of pleasure long enough to give it its due. He does not want to be misread as an ascetic, a thinker who believes the good life should be dry and effortful and stripped of enjoyment. His view is more interesting than that. Pleasure, he says, accompanies virtuous activity, the way the bloom accompanies a healthy plant, not as the plant's goal, but as the natural completion of the plant's proper functioning. When a person acts courageously in a situation that genuinely requires courage, and their character is genuinely courageous, rather than merely performing courage, there is a pleasure in that action that belongs to the action, not a pleasure added on from outside, like a reward after the work, but a pleasure that is internal to the activity itself, the pleasure of a capacity being fully and excellently used. The flute player who has practiced long and carefully and plays a difficult phrase with complete ease and rightness, this person does not choose between pleasure and excellence. They receive both in the same moment because the pleasure is the felt form of the excellence. And the same is true, Aristotle believes, across the whole range of virtuous activity. The generous person who gives freely does not give in spite of pleasure, but feels something that is genuinely pleasant in the act of giving, because the act expresses their nature fully. The pleasure is not the goal is the activity itself. But the pleasure is what that activity feels like from the inside when it is going well. This is the claim that separates Aristotle most sharply from the ancient view that virtue requires suffering, and from the modern view that pleasure is the point. He is making a third claim, that virtue and pleasure are not in competition, that the conflict only arises when what is being pursued as pleasure is actually something shallower than the pleasure that genuine flourishing produces. The person who understands this deeply does not have to choose between living well and living pleasantly. They discover through the practice of living well that the pleasure that accompanies it is deeper and more durable than the pleasures that were available through the simpler routes. The afternoon in Athens has gone on. The student's finger has left the papyrus. The word is still there on the page, unchanged. But it means something different now than it did when the tracing began, not because the letters have changed, but because the word has been slowly inhabited, the way a house becomes a home, not through any single act, but through the accumulation of specific ordinary days spent inside it. Daemon, well, the inner spirit flourishing, the soul at work according to its best nature, not a feeling that arrives and departs, not a summit that requires exceptional circumstances, not a possession that can be stored and retrieved. Something more like a quality of living, a way of moving through ordinary time that has been shaped by habit and attention and the slow architecture of practiced care until the living itself becomes the thing it was always reaching toward. Aristotle is careful, even in his most confident passages, about one thing. He does not claim that the account he is offering will be received as simple. He knows that what he is describing is harder to hold on to than the alternatives, precisely because it cannot be accumulated or displayed. There is no external measure for it. There is no point at which it is finished. The person living in accordance with eudaimonia does not arrive somewhere and stop. They continue through the varied weather of a whole life, exercising the capacities that make a life fully human, finding the mean between excess and deficiency in each new situation that arrives, attending with care to the people and the world and the questions that their life has given them. And this, Aristotle believes, is not a burden. The framing of it as a burden is a misreading. The flute player does not experience their long practice as a burden once the capacity has been genuinely formed. The craftsman does not experience the excellence of their craft as something imposed from outside. What is difficult is the formation, the early years of habit building, the repeated choices that feel effortful before they become natural. But the fully formed virtue is not effort in the ordinary sense. It is more like ease, the particular ease that belongs to a capacity being used exactly as it was shaped to be used. There is something in this vision that is genuinely quiet, not quiet in the sense of passive or withdrawn from life. Aristotle's best person is fully engaged with the world, with its people, with its demands, with the specific occasions that virtue requires, but quiet in the sense that the root of it, the foundation from which all of this activity grows, is not anxious, it is not reaching, it is not waiting for a peak that hasn't arrived yet. It is already at work in the texture of whatever day is actually present. The student in Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era sets the papyrus aside. The word is written. The afternoon is going. Outside, the city is exactly as loud as it always is, going about its business with the unself-conscious efficiency of a place that has been going about its business for a very long time. And something about the argument just traced on the page has made the ordinary sounds of that city feel, for a moment, not less ordinary, but somehow more, not more dramatic, not more significant in any way that requires celebration, simply more present, more fully what they are. This is not an experience Aristotle names anywhere in the Ethics. He is not writing about the phenomenology of reading his own argument, but it is something the argument tends to produce in the careful reader, a slight shift in the quality of attention, a mild reorientation toward the ordinary, a quiet recalibration of where the good things in a life actually are, not in the peaks, not in the accumulations, in the activity, in the engagement, in the careful, attentive, honest movement through a life that belongs to a person who has taken the question of living well seriously enough to ask it. The swallow Aristotle mentions is a real bird. It really does appear before the season. It is really present in the sky above Athens in the weeks before spring has fully arrived, and it really is beautiful, and its presence really does carry the felt intimation of the season coming. But Aristotle is insisting, gently, that the bird is not the season. The season is larger than any single appearance within it. The season requires the full turning of something slow, the gradual warming of longer days, the return of warmth to the soil, the the patient accumulation of days that are each slightly more than the day before, until one morning a person steps outside and recognizes, without being able to point to the specific day it happened, that spring is simply there now, not arrived, not achieved, just there in the way that seasons are there, slowly, completely, without announcement, and happiness, understood the way the student in that room is beginning to understand it, is not the swallow. It is not the single bright day, or the single season of good fortune, or the single act of genuine courage that stands out afterward in the memory as the time everything came together. It is the season itself. It is what a whole life looks like when it has been genuinely and consistently lived from its best capacities. It is the slow, accumulative, unremarkable activity of a soul doing what a soul is for, not in any single extraordinary moment, but across the entire long ordinary span of days, that together make something that deserves, finally, to be called a life. The student in the room is somewhere inside that season already. All the small, careful choices of the last month, the last year, the last decade, the moments of patience or honesty or genuine attention that passed without note or recognition, these are not the preparation for the season. They are the season itself. They always were. The argument traced on the page has not created anything that wasn't already there. It has only made it possible, perhaps for the first time, to see what was already happening and to know it by its proper name. The word eudaimonia rests on the page. The room holds still. Outside, the city continues, and the season, unhurried and already underway, turns slowly in the direction of its own completion, the way seasons do, without asking anything, without announcing itself, simply present in the accumulated texture of everything that is, quietly and without exception, already here. Aristotle was watching a potter's hands. The man worked at a wheel near the edge of the agora early in the morning, before the crowd arrived and the noise of commerce swallowed everything. His hands moved with a kind of knowledge that had nothing to do with thinking. They pressed and released, steadied and urged, and the clay rose and settled and rose again without a single moment of visible decision. Aristotle stood at a short distance, not intruding, watching with the particular attention he reserved for things that were doing exactly what they were built to do. He had that quality, the ability to go still in the presence of something working well. The potter did not consult a rule. He did not pause to ask himself what the rule for centering clay on a wheel might be, and then apply it. The knowledge was in his hands. It had gotten there through 10,000 mornings at the wheel, through clay that collapsed and clay that held, through the long accumulative pressure of repetition on a willing body. Somewhere in all those mornings, the skill had stopped being something he did and had become something he was. His hands simply knew. Aristotle watched for a while and then walked on. The sight stayed with him, though. It stayed with him through the lecture he gave that afternoon, and through the notes he made in the cooler part of the evening, and through the long development of his thinking about what it means for a human being to live well, because the potter had shown him something he would spend years finding the language for, that the deepest capacities are not rules carried in the mind, but shapes carried in the body, built through repetition into something that no longer requires effort to maintain. The skill and the skilled person have become, over time, a single thing. He would eventually find the Greek word for it, hexis, a stable, settled disposition, something held in the whole of a person rather than merely remembered or recited. But the word came later. The potter came first. Virtue, in Aristotle's understanding, is not an instruction. It is not a code one follows, a principle one applies, or a set of prohibitions one observes. It is a hexis, a disposition of the whole person, settled through long practice into something so thoroughly integrated that it no longer needs to announce itself. The virtuous person does not face a situation and consult an inner manual. They perceive the situation clearly, feel appropriately in response to what is actually there, and act from the fullness of who they have become. The action flows from the character the way the pot flows from the potter's hands, shaped by all the mornings that came before. This is a different kind of ethics from the one most people inherit. Most accounts of morality are built around rules, duties, prohibitions, calculations. They describe what actions are right or wrong and offer some principle for telling them apart. Aristotle's account is built around a prior question. Before asking what the right action is, he asks what kind of person one needs to be in order to reliably perceive and choose and feel rightly, and the answer is a person whose character has been formed through the long, patient accumulation of practice. Not the right rule, but the right self. Not the commandment consulted in a moment of decision, but the disposition already present before the moment arrives. What this means, among other things, is that the foundation of ethical life is not knowledge, it is formation. One can know everything Aristotle writes about virtue and still not be virtuous, in the same way that one can read everything ever written about pottery and still not be able to center clay on a wheel. The reading is not nothing, but it is not the thing itself. The thing itself comes from the practice. It comes from doing. He makes the point plainly, in what sounds almost too simple to be a philosophical claim. We become just by doing just acts. We become courageous by doing courageous acts. We become generous by doing generous acts. The virtues are built from their own exercise, the way strength is built from lifting and balance from walking. There is no shortcut that goes around the practice. There is no purely interior transformation, no conversion experience, no moment of pure illumination that produces a virtuous character without the long work of doing. The character is the work, accumulated and settled, the way the potter's knowledge is the mornings at the wheel, settled into the hands. For a culture accustomed to the drama of conversion, the moment of transformation, the sudden arrival of clarity or commitment, this is a quiet and somewhat demanding view. It says that who one is being built right now, in the ordinary, undramatic texture of daily choosing, in the small decisions that seem too minor to carry moral weight. The person who chooses patience over irritability, in a moment too small to seem significant, is doing something, Aristotle insists. They are not merely behaving rightly in that moment. They are, by a nearly imperceptible increment, becoming more patient. And the person who goes the other way, who takes the small shortcut, the minor evasion, the barely noticeable unkindness, is also doing something by the same logic, in the same quiet and accumulative way. This is not an argument designed to produce anxiety. It is not, in Aristotle's hands, a warning. It is something closer to an observation about the structure of a life, offered in the same spirit that one might observe that rivers are made of rain. The river is not assembled all at once. It gathers, and the character gathers in the same way, from the same accumulation of small and particular moments, most of which pass without anyone marking them. There is a house in Athens in the early morning. A boy of perhaps 12 is helping his mother with some task, something that requires care and steadiness and a willingness to do a thing again after it goes wrong. The task has gone wrong. The mother handles it without irritation, sets the thing right, begins again, does not make the wrongness into anything larger than it is. The boy watches. He does not take a lesson from this. He does not think, I will remember to respond to failure the way my mother responds to it. He simply inhabits a household where equanimity is the ordinary weather, where care is practiced without ceremony, where patience is not spoken of but performed daily, the way breathing is performed, without announcement, without effort, as the natural expression of a body that has been breathing for years. Aristotle would say that this boy is receiving a moral education, not in the formal sense of instruction in ethics, not in the recitation of principles or the analysis of cases. He is receiving an education in the deeper sense. His character is being shaped by the daily texture of a life lived around people whose dispositions have been formed in particular ways. He is learning, without knowing he is learning, what patience looks like in practice. He is, through thousands of unremarkable mornings, being shaped toward a way of being in the world. This is why Aristotle takes habituation, ethos from which the word ethics itself descends, so seriously as the ground of moral life. Before the philosophical arguments, before the examination of cases, before the careful articulation of what virtue is and how it is identified, there is the prior question of what kind of person one has become through the accidents and intentions of one's upbringing and daily practice. The arguments matter, the examination matters, the careful articulation matters enormously, but they operate on material already partly formed, the way a teacher works with students who arrive already shaped by the years that came before the classroom. The generosity practiced daily in a household without fanfare becomes eventually generosity felt as natural, generosity that does not require decision. It becomes what the person is, rather than what the person does. This is what Aristotle means by virtue as hexis, and this is why he believes that the formation of character in early life, within households and communities, and cities that embody certain habits of practice, is among the most serious matters of moral and political concern. But Aristotle is careful here. He has anticipated the misreading, and he resists it with some energy in his lectures. The most common misunderstanding of what he is building toward is the assumption that virtue occupies a comfortable middle, that to be courageous is to be a little brave, that to be generous is to give a moderate amount, that the virtuous person is the one who avoids the extremes and settles reliably and without difficulty for something in between. The doctrine of the mean mesotes sounds at first like an argument for moderation in all things, for a kind of safe and undemanding reasonableness that steers clear of the difficult edges of human experience. This is not what Aristotle means. He is quite particular about this. The mean he is pointing toward is not a mathematical midpoint between two quantities. It is not a fixed position on a scale, located reliably at the midpoint, and available to anyone who simply avoids the extremes. It is instead the right response, the appropriate response, relative to the person, the situation, the relationships involved, and what these particular circumstances call for. And finding that response is not easy. It requires something he calls phronesis, practical wisdom, and he is clear that practical wisdom is itself the product of long experience, hard thinking, and the accumulated weight of having faced many particular situations and worked through what each of them asked. The mean is the territory of excellence, not the territory of mediocrity. It is where the best possible response lives, and the distance between that territory and either extreme, between courage and both cowardice and recklessness, is not measured in equal intervals. The mean is wherever the right response is, and that location shifts with every change in the person, the danger, and the weight of what is at stake. Two people in the same objective situation may face very different appropriate responses because they bring different capacities, different responsibilities, different relationships to what they are facing. What courage requires of one person in a given moment may be different from what it requires of another. Consider two soldiers. They are in the same battle, facing the same danger, standing in the same morning light. The first has convinced himself that there is nothing to fear. He carries himself with a kind of performative confidence, a rehearsed fearlessness that impresses at a distance but has never been tested honestly against what is actually in front of him. He has not reckoned with the danger. His confidence is not the fruit of having honestly weighed the risk and found the response. It is the avoidance of honest reckoning, dressed in the clothing of bravery. Aristotle looks at this soldier and recognizes not courage, but recklessness, or something even less than recklessness, a kind of refusal of reality, a flight from the truth of the situation disguised as strength. The second soldier is afraid, genuinely, honestly afraid, in the way that the situation warrants, because the situation is genuinely, honestly dangerous. He knows what he is facing. He has let the danger be what it is without diminishing it or looking away from it, and yet he is present. He is not overwhelmed by the fear, not paralyzed or turned from what the moment asks of him. He has made room for the fear and has not let it become the determining fact of the situation. He is there, steady and committed, doing what the moment asks, with the fear present and acknowledged rather than suppressed or denied. Aristotle places virtue entirely with the second person, because the second person's relationship to the danger is true. The fear they feel is an accurate response to what is actually there, and their continued engagement with what the situation asks is not despite the fear, but alongside it, carrying it, remaining in honest contact with what is real. This is what courage is, not the absence of appropriate feeling, but the appropriate management of it, the disposition to feel what the situation actually calls for, and to act from that honest contact rather than from a false confidence that has not paid the price of genuine reckoning. The mean, held in this light, looks less like moderation and more like precision. It is what is exactly right, and exactness in human affairs requires a capacity for perception that goes far beyond rule following. This is where phronesis enters, the master virtue, in Aristotle's account of the moral life, the capacity that coordinates all the others. Practical wisdom is not itself one virtue among the rest. It is the capacity that makes all the other virtues fully virtuous. Without it, even a disposition toward generosity can go wrong, giving too much to the wrong person at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. Without it, courage can slide, in ways almost invisible to the person involved, toward recklessness on one side, or toward a more sophisticated and well-rationalized cowardice on the other. Practical wisdom is what sees clearly where the mean actually is in this situation. For this person, given what these relationships require and what the stakes genuinely are, it is not rule application. It is perception, the kind of seeing that recognizes the morally relevant features of a concrete, particular, unrepeatable situation and finds what it asks, and it grows from experience in exactly the way the potter's skill grows from mornings at the wheel, through the accumulation of faced situations, worked through difficulties, the slow education of perception by the actual texture of life as it presents itself. This is why Aristotle says, in a passage that can seem strange at first, that young people may be good mathematicians, but are unlikely to be genuinely practically wise. The mathematics of a 20-year-old can be as correct as the mathematics of a 60-year-old. but the practical wisdom of a 60-year-old who has lived carefully and honestly through 4 decades of varied circumstances, relationships, and decisions is not available to someone who has not yet faced those circumstances, navigated those relationships, or made and learned from those decisions. Phronesis is grown in time, the way a deep-rooted tree is grown, not by being told what trees look like, but by existing slowly through the seasons that form the wood. There is a word Aristotle uses that does not quite translate. The courageous person, the generous person, the just person, Aristotle says they are philikalos, a lover of what is fine and beautiful. Not just someone who does the right thing, but someone for whom the right thing has become, through long habituation and the formation of genuine character, genuinely attractive. Someone whose desires and perceptions and emotional responses have been shaped through the slow work of practice and formation so that they are drawn toward virtue rather than merely choosing it in the face of resistance. This matters because for Aristotle, the person who does the right thing, but only against the grain of their own desires, who is generous but resentful about it, or honest but only through white-knuckled effort, is not yet fully virtuous, however admirable the behavior. They are what he calls continent, which is better than incontinence, and he says so plainly, but it is not the condition he is pointing toward. The fully virtuous person does not merely manage their desires in the direction of virtue. Their desires have been formed by virtue, shaped through the long practice of living well, so that they find the generous act genuinely appealing and the unjust act genuinely repellent, not as a performance of feeling, but as the authentic response of a character that has been built toward excellence. This is a demanding picture. It asks not just that a person behave well, but that they become someone for whom behaving well is, eventually, the natural expression of who they are. It asks that the formation of character go all the way down into the feelings, the desires, the immediate perceptions and emotional responses, not just the considered decisions made after deliberation. And it is honest about the fact that this depth of formation requires time, requires the right kind of habituation in early life, requires the sustained practice of excellent action over years and decades. It does not promise that this is easy, but it is also not the counsel of despair. The person who is not yet philokalos, who does the right thing through effort against the grain of unformed desires, is already partway there. The practice itself, sustained honestly, is the path. The doctrine of the mean spreads across the whole range of human virtues, and Aristotle maps it with patience. Courage sits between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity, what he calls eleutheriates, sits between miserliness and prodigality. Truthfulness about oneself sits between self-deprecation and boastfulness. Appropriate pride sits between the person who vastly overestimates their worth and the person who, with equal distortion, vastly underestimates it. Even in matters of social interaction, in the degree of humor and playfulness appropriate between people, Aristotle finds a virtue. The person who is wittily sociable, without descending into buffoonery or rising into a cold and humorless severity. In every domain of human experience, where one can feel or act too much or too little, there is, for Aristotle, a mean, and at each mean, a virtue, and at each virtue, the question, what practice builds it? What this map reveals, taken together, is a portrait of a person who is in genuine, responsive contact with the world. The virtuous person is not sealed off from experience by an impenetrable composure. They feel fear when fear is warranted. They feel anger when anger is warranted. They feel delight, affection, grief, indignation, All of these are appropriate responses to the appropriate objects, felt to the appropriate degree, held and expressed in the appropriate way. The virtuous person is not someone who has reduced their emotional life to a controlled minimum. They are someone whose emotional responses have become accurate. Their feelings have been educated toward the truth of situations, the way the potter's hands have been educated toward the truth of the clay. This is among the more unusual features of Aristotle's ethics, and it is easy to miss because the language of virtue can sound like the language of suppression, as though the point is to hold the feelings in check, to keep the emotional life subordinate to a controlling reason. But Aristotle is describing something different. The goal is not the domination of feeling by reason, but the formation of feeling by reason, over time, through the slow discipline of living carefully and honestly. The result is a person whose reason and feeling have become aligned, not fighting each other, not one suppressing the other, but both oriented together toward what is genuinely good and genuinely true about the situations they face. Outside a house in Athens, a woman in her middle years is practicing a particular art without knowing it. She has been asked an unreasonable thing by someone she cares about. The thing being asked is genuinely unreasonable. She is not telling herself a story about it, not exaggerating the imposition. She sees it clearly, and yet the person asking is not acting from malice, but from something more ordinary, from anxiety, from a need they do not have good language for, from a confusion about what help actually looks like. She sees this clearly too, and from that double clarity, the clarity about what is being asked, and the clarity about the person asking, she fashions a response that is neither capitulation nor refusal, neither a pretending that the request is reasonable, nor a cold correction of the person who made it. Aristotle would not have been surprised by her. He would have recognized in what she did the exercise of practical wisdom applied to a situation so ordinary that it will leave no record. A moment between two people in which one of them navigated the competing demands of honesty and care with the skill of long practice, finding the response that was right for these people in this situation, given everything that was true about it. There was no rule she followed. There was no principle she applied. There was only the clear perception of what was actually there, and a character formed to respond to that perception with something close to grace. This is what the doctrine of the mean comes to, in the end, when it leaves the lecture and enters the street. Not a formula, not a compromise, a kind of skilled and clear-eyed responsiveness to the particular truth of each situation as it actually is, a capacity built from practice, a disposition cultivated over time until it has become, in the deepest sense, who one is. The formation of character is invisible most of the time. This is one of the stranger features of Aristotle's account, and one worth holding. The process through which a person's hexis is built, through which their dispositions are gradually shaped into something stable and settled, does not announce itself. The thousands of small decisions that constitute the slow construction of character do not feel in the moment of each one like the building of anything. They feel like ordinary days. They feel like small choices in small situations, none of which seems significant enough to carry the weight that Aristotle is placing on them, and yet the weight is there. Aristotle insists on it, not as a warning, but as a structural fact about how character is actually made. Each small act of patience is by a nearly invisible increment building patience. Each small act of honesty is building honesty. Each small act of generosity is over time building toward a person for whom generosity is the natural, unconsidered response to situations that call for it. The accumulation is real, even when no single moment of accumulation feels decisive. An older person looks back over decades of small choices, not the great moments, not the obvious crossroads, not the decisions that were recognized as significant when they were being made, the small ones, the moments of patience or impatience in conversations so unremarkable they were forgotten the same day, the moments of honesty or evasion in situations too minor to have seemed worth noticing, the choices to pay attention or to be somewhere else inside the same body that was physically present. And in the accumulated pattern of all those small moments, looking back from a distance that makes the pattern visible, there is something that deserves the name of character, not constructed in a single turning point, not assembled in a moment of decision or revelation, built the way all enduring things are built, from the patient accumulation of ordinary days. The young craftsman who came to Aristotle's mind was not yet excellent. His pots were uneven, his hands not yet educated by enough mornings. But he was at the wheel. He was practicing. He was doing the thing that would over time and with honest attention become the capacity that would one day move through his hands without deliberate thought. He was, right now, in the middle of the process by which he would eventually become what he was practicing to be. This is where Aristotle's account of virtue becomes, in the quietest possible way, generous. It does not ask whether the character is already formed. It does not divide human beings into the virtuous and the deficient, and locate each person permanently on one side of that line. It asks only what is being built, right now, in the ordinary practice of an ordinary life. It recognizes that character is always in formation, that the dispositions are always being reinforced or subtly redirected by the texture of daily choosing, and that this is true of every human life at every moment, not just the lives of those who have already arrived at something that looks from the outside like excellence. The process is ongoing. The mean is always being found or missed in the actual, particular, unrepeatable situations of lived experience. The phronesis is always being exercised or neglected, sharpened or left to dull. The emotional life is always being gradually educated or gradually miseducated by the patterns of response that are practiced day after day in the texture of what looks like ordinary life, but is, in Aristotle's account, the only site where character actually lives. There is a phrase Aristotle does not use, but that his account seems to reach toward. The practice precedes the person. The potter who has never touched clay cannot know what their hands can eventually learn. The musician who has never played cannot know what the hands can eventually hold, or what the music eventually moving through them will feel like, not separate from them, not an achievement they are producing, but something they have, through long practice, become capable of receiving, the way a well-shaped vessel receives what it was shaped to hold. The virtue is there before it is felt to be there. It is being built in the practice long before it becomes the character, the person who is patient, not yet quite enough to be fully patient, who tries at patience and sometimes finds it and sometimes falls short and tries again, is already somewhere inside the process. The disposition is forming. The hexus is being built, not fully, not yet. But the process of becoming is already the thing it is becoming, just not arrived at yet, the way a young tree is already a tree, and not something else. Aristotle watched the potter until the morning crowd arrived and swallowed the edge of the agora in noise. Then he walked on, carrying what he had seen, the hands moving without deliberate thought, the skill indistinguishable from the person, the capacity that had become, through long practice, the shape of how the person met the world. There is a musician somewhere, playing through a difficult phrase for perhaps the 10th time that morning. The phrase goes slightly wrong in the same place it has gone slightly wrong on each of the preceding 9 attempts. The error is small, not dramatic, not enough to ruin what surrounds it, but real, and the musician knows it, and they return again to the beginning of the phrase without frustration, or with a frustration so mild and familiar that it has become simply part of the practice. They play through the phrase again. Somewhere in the slight correction made this time, something shifts. Not all the way, not enough that a listener would hear a transformation, but real. Aristotle was deeply interested in people like this, not because skill at music was among his highest philosophical concerns, but because what the musician is doing at that lectern in the early morning is the same thing being done by every person who is, in any domain, in any practice, anywhere in the world, in the slow work of becoming who they are capable of being. The phrase is practiced again. The hexis deepens, invisibly, and when the phrase eventually becomes what the musician was practicing it toward, flowing, assured, requiring no deliberate effort to navigate, it will seem from the outside like a gift. From the inside, it will feel like recognition, like meeting, finally, the person one has been in the process of becoming. This is the architecture of character, as Aristotle understands it. Not dramatic, not sudden, not the result of a single revelation or a single great choice. Built from practice, shaped through habituation, refined by the accumulated experience of having faced many situations and learned, slowly and imperfectly and honestly, what each of them asked. A disposition so thoroughly practiced that it no longer requires deliberate effort. Hands that know, a character that is simply who one is, not a performance maintained against resistance, but the natural expression of a person who has been in all the ordinary days of an ordinary life, gradually becoming themselves. And this depth of character, Aristotle would want to say, is not a gift one either has or doesn't. It is not granted by nature or withheld by circumstance. It is being built right now in the unremarkable texture of living, in the choices too small to seem significant, and the days too ordinary to remember. The potter at the wheel did not begin with educated hands. The musician did not begin with a phrase that flowed. The generous person did not begin with a character inclined by nature toward giving. They began, each of them, where the practice begins, at the start, uncertain, imperfect, at the wheel in the early morning, before the crowd arrived, making something that was not yet what it was going to become. Aristotle arrived at the symposium late enough that the first cups had already been poured, and the conversation had taken on the relaxed, unhurried shape that only comes after the formal toasts are done. He took a place near the edge of the room, where the lamplight was thinner, and watched. This was something he did often, not from shyness and not from indifference, but from the particular quality of attention he had learned to trust in himself, the kind that sees more when it is not yet speaking. The room held perhaps 15 people. Some had come as colleagues, some as admirers, some because the host owed them a favor and the invitation was how the debt was being settled, and a few, perhaps 3 or 4, seated close together near the far wall, were there because they genuinely wanted to be in the same room as one another, and the symposium happened to be the occasion. He watched the differences without needing to name them. They named themselves in posture, in the way attention moved or failed to move, in which conversations continued after the wine was poured, and which ones found their natural end. The people who had come for advantage were easy to identify. They listened carefully, but only to the parts of what was said that might be useful to them, and their replies were shaped less by what had been spoken than by what they wanted the speaker to think of them. Nothing wrong in this exactly. The world runs, in part, on the exchange of useful things, and a man who helps you when you need it and expects the same in return has given you something real. But Aristotle had been watching human relationships long enough to know that this kind of association, however genuine its pleasures, is built on a foundation that shifts the moment the usefulness ends, when the merchant moves away, when the political alliance no longer serves. When the shared project is finished, the thing that had held them together departs, and what is left behind is generally not friendship, only the memory of one. Pleasure-based associations were subtler, and he found them interesting in a different way. Two people who simply enjoy each other's company, who laugh at the same things and share a taste for the same arguments. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, a very real good, and Aristotle was not a philosopher who made the mistake of treating it otherwise. But pleasure changes. What delights at 20 has a different texture at 40. The wit that felt sharp and exhilarating when both people were young can begin to feel, over years, like a room they have been in too long. And when the pleasure diminishes or changes shape, the people who were held together by it tend to find, with some surprise and some sadness, that they did not actually know each other as well as the laughter had suggested. They had known the enjoyment they produced in each other, which is a different thing. Across the room, two men were talking with the particular quality of attention that had drawn Aristotle's gaze in the first place. They were not performing for the room. They were not checking, even subtly, to see who was watching them or what impression the conversation was making. One of them said something, and the other listened in a way that seemed to take the whole weight of what had been said seriously, not just the surface of it, not just the useful or entertaining portions, but the whole thought, including the parts that were unresolved. And when he replied, it was to what had actually been said, which is rarer than it sounds. Aristotle had watched enough conversations to know that most replies are prepared before the other person has finished speaking, launched from an already formed position, rather than genuinely offered in response to what arrived. What he was watching across the room was different. It had the quality of real exchange, two people thinking together, the outcome of the conversation not yet decided before it began. He had been trying to find the right words for what distinguished this kind of relationship from the others for some time. The word the Greeks used, philia, covered all of them, the useful and the pleasant, and this third kind alike, and he had come to feel that the single word was doing too much work, that it was obscuring a set of distinctions that mattered in ways the undifferentiated term could not carry, because what he was watching across the room was not merely a more intense or durable version of the pleasant association or the useful one. It was structurally different. The two men were not primarily interested in what each other could do for them. They were not primarily interested in the enjoyment the other produced. What they were interested in, as far as Aristotle could tell, was the other person, the particular, specific, irreplaceable person sitting across from them, with all their actual qualities and limits and ways of moving through the world. He set down his cup and returned to a thought he had been turning over for weeks. In the best kind of friendship, something happens to the boundary between one person's good and another's. Not that the boundary disappears entirely. He was not describing some dissolution of the self into another, which would be its own confusion, but the line becomes genuinely unclear. When a person loves their friend in the right way, the friend's flourishing is not an obligation they take on, or a cost they are willing to bear for some greater advantage. It is simply part of what they want, in the same immediate and unconditional way they want their own good. The friend's difficulty is their difficulty. The friend's small happiness, the good project that finally came together, the conversation that went well, the morning that arrived unexpectedly clear, lands in them as a real thing, not as news about someone else, as something that matters the way their own life matters, because at some level they can no longer fully separate the two. There was a phrase for this that he had written down and returned to several times, uncertain whether it was too stark or exactly right. Allos odos, another self. He had set the stylus down after writing it and sat for a while because the phrase seemed to be pointing at something that needed to be sat with. It was not saying that the friend becomes indistinguishable from oneself, which would be untrue and also somewhat alarming. It was saying that genuine friendship involves a kind of self-extension, a genuine widening of what one counts as one's own. The care one feels for one's own flourishing and the care one feels for the friend's flourishing have, over time and through the slow accumulation of shared life, become genuinely intertwined, not fused, but no longer fully separable. And this, he thought, was not a weakness or a vulnerability, though it does make one more susceptible to the world's reversals. It was part of what living well actually looked like, if you were honest about it. Perfect friendship, philia teleia, the phrase he used when he wanted to mark the distinction clearly, was founded on something different from utility or pleasure, though it included both. It was founded on mutual admiration of character, two people who see each other clearly, including the parts that are not admirable, and who still find in the other someone whose way of moving through the world they genuinely respect. Not the performance of a person, not the idea of them, not the version they present when things are going well, but the actual person, with their actual dispositions, their actual patterns of courage and generosity, and small lapses, and each of them wishing for the other's genuine flourishing, not their momentary satisfaction, or their reputation, or their success in the narrow sense, but the deeper thing that the others should become more fully themselves, more fully at work in their best capacities, more fully alive. He watched the two men across the room for another moment, then let his gaze move elsewhere. Outside the house, Athens was settling into its late evening rhythms, torches burning at corners, the smell of cooking from somewhere down the street, the sound of the harbor, faint and continuous, carrying under everything else. He had lived in this city for 20 years by then, and it still interested him in the way a complex organism interests a careful observer, not as an abstraction, not as a set of laws or institutions considered in isolation, but as a living thing with its own patterns and pressures and forms of health and illness. The city. He kept returning to it, not because the arguments required him to, but because he genuinely believed that it was inseparable from the question he was trying to answer. What does it mean to live well? He had colleagues and students who thought the question could be answered by looking inward, by finding the right inner state, the right relationship to one's own desires and judgments, and achieving through that inward work a kind of sufficiency that the external world could not disturb. He understood the appeal, but it seemed to him, the more carefully he followed the argument, that it required a kind of abstraction from the actual texture of human life that his better instincts refused, because human beings are not in the first instance self-contained units. They are, by the deepest requirements of their nature, beings who live among and through and with others. He had written the phrase carefully, wanting to get it right, politikon zone, a political animal, by which he did not mean merely that humans happen, as a matter of fact, to congregate in groups, the way certain other social creatures do. He meant something more specific and more interesting. He meant that the kind of life available to a human being in genuine community, In a polis organized around shared ideas of justice and the good, made possible by the capacity for reasoned speech, is not just a version of the solitary life with other people added to it. It is a structurally different form of life, one in which certain capacities and virtues that could not otherwise exist at all find the conditions they need to actually become real. Justice, for instance, the virtue he had spent perhaps more time thinking about than any other, because it seemed to him the most resistant to private cultivation. What would it mean to be just in isolation? The disposition could perhaps be cultivated in thought, in intention, in how one prepared oneself to act. But the actual exercise of justice, the practice of rendering to others what is genuinely due them, of participating in a community with fairness and care, of supporting institutions that allow people to live together without constant violence and domination. This is an activity that cannot take place in the absence of others. The virtue that names it is not a quality one can have and express purely through private inner work. It requires the presence of other people, the existence of shared practices, the reality of a community within which the act of justice is intelligible as justice rather than merely as a transfer of goods. He had thought about this carefully in relation to someone who had made a point of rejecting the polis altogether. The story of Diogenes was well known in Athens, the philosopher who lived in a jar, who called himself a citizen of the world rather than any particular city, who made a philosophical gesture of needing nothing that the polis provided. Aristotle did not dismiss this. There was something philosophically serious in the challenge Diogenes posed, a genuine question about what the city owed human flourishing and whether its demands might constrain rather than enable the best human life. But he found himself, in the end, unconvinced. Not because the gesture was not striking, it clearly was, but because the vision of the fully self-sufficient human being struck him as describing something that was either more than human or less than human, but not quite the thing he was trying to understand. The being who needs no city, no community, no relationships organized around shared justice and mutual concern. Either that being has transcended what is humanly possible, which is not a useful model, or it has not yet arrived at the fullness of human life, which is a different kind of falling short. He was not arguing for the city, as it actually was, which was in his time deeply imperfect, in ways that required no great effort to observe. The exclusions of Athenian democracy, the limits of whose voice counted in the assembly, the distance between the ideals the city claimed and the practices it actually maintained. He saw all of this, and it troubled him, and his political philosophy was not an apology for any particular existing arrangement. But the imperfections of actual cities did not, in his view, argue against the polis as a form of life. They argued for better cities, because the form itself, the community organized around reasoned deliberation about what is just and what is good, the shared institutions that make it possible to act with others rather than merely alongside them, this form was, he believed, the natural habitat of human excellence. And the virtues flourished within that habitat in ways they could not elsewhere. Courage, exercised in the service of the community's protection and in the face of real dangers shared by real people. Generosity, practiced not in the abstract but in the actual texture of a city, where specific people needed specific kinds of support. Honesty, maintained in relationships that had a history and a future and a context of shared purposes. Even the private virtues, the ways one managed one's desires and tempers and relationships to pleasure, took their full shape when embedded in the forms of life that only community makes available. The person who cultivates these virtues in isolation cultivates something real, perhaps, but something incomplete, in the same way that an instrument carefully tuned but never played is incomplete. The music requires more than the instrument. Late in the symposium, the conversation at the far wall where the two men had been talking grew quieter and then stopped altogether. They were simply sitting, it seemed, in a comfortable silence that needed no filling. Aristotle noticed this and found it interesting. There is a quality of silence between two people who know each other well and genuinely care for each other's flourishing that is very different from the silence of strangers, or from the strained silence of two people who have run out of things to say. It was the silence of people who had been thinking together long enough that the thinking could now rest, and the resting was its own kind of companionship. He thought about the students who had walked with him along the colonnaded paths of the Lyceum on many mornings, the conversations that moved between the formal and the exploratory, the arguments that started in one place and arrived somewhere no one had anticipated. The rhythm of those mornings had its own texture. The thinking was real and sometimes difficult, but it was also unforced. It moved because they were all genuinely curious about where it would go, not because they were performing philosophical inquiry for an audience. And he had noticed over the years that the thinking done in genuine community had a quality different from the thinking done alone. Not better or worse exactly, but different in kind. Ideas arrived in the space between people that neither person would have generated on their own. Arguments found their weaknesses more quickly when someone was genuinely trying to help find them. The common project, which was simply the honest investigation of whatever question had presented itself, created between the people engaged in it a kind of shared enterprise that was itself a form of philia, organized not around use or pleasure primarily, but around the mutual admiration of each other's honest thinking. The Lyceum was a place, but it was also a practice. The library that had accumulated there over years, the books on logic and rhetoric, on the anatomy of fish and the constitutions of cities, on the soul and the first principles of the natural world, had been gathered by many hands, organized through many conversations, built up through many small acts of research and observation and honest disagreement. No single person owned it. No single person had made it. It had come into existence through the accumulated work of a community that shared a purpose, and the sharing of the purpose was what made it a community, rather than merely a collection of individuals who happened to occupy the same building. He thought about a specific afternoon the previous spring when a student had returned from a long trip to the coast of Asia Minor with a set of careful observations about the breeding habits of a particular species of fish. The student had spent 3 weeks watching and noting, and what he had found disagreed with a claim Aristotle had made in a lecture the previous year. The student had been nervous about presenting this, which Aristotle had found both touching and slightly unfortunate, because the disagreement was not a problem. It was, from Aristotle's perspective, exactly how the investigation was supposed to work. The careful observation of the actual world brought into honest contact with the best account the philosophical community had so far been able to produce, and then the account revised where the observation required it. The truth, whatever shape it turned out to have, was not the possession of any individual. It was the ongoing product of patient attention applied to the world by people who genuinely cared about getting it right. There was a civic dimension to this too, he thought, though it was not always obvious. The practice of honest inquiry, of caring more about what is actually true than about the defense of one's prior position, of listening to disagreement with genuine attention, of revising one's views when the evidence required it. This was not merely an intellectual virtue in the narrow sense. It was a form of character, and character, cultivated through thousands of small practices, shapes the kind of person one becomes in every domain, including the domain of civic life. The person who learns to receive disagreement without defensiveness in the context of philosophical investigation is practicing something that has consequences in how they participate in political deliberation, in how they treat people who see the world differently, in how they handle the inevitable conflicts that arise in shared life. The virtues do not stay in their original domain, they spread. Athens was quieter now. The symposium was winding down. People were finding their sandals, exchanging the particular kind of farewell that comes at the end of a long evening, warm but not urgent, the energy of the night settling toward its natural end. Aristotle stepped out into the street and stood for a moment in the cool air, looking up at the sky, which was fully dark now and densely scattered with stars. He had been thinking for some time about the relationship between the good of the individual and the good of the community, trying to find the formulation that did justice to both without collapsing one into the other, because there was a real danger in both directions. One could make the mistake of treating civic participation as merely instrumental, something the individual engages in because the city provides the conditions for a private flourishing that is the real goal, with public life being a necessary cost rather than a genuine good. He found this view ultimately incoherent because the virtues that constitute personal flourishing, courage, justice, generosity, cannot be fully exercised in the absence of a community, which means that the community is not merely the backdrop against which personal flourishing occurs, but one of its constitutive conditions. But one could equally make the error of absorbing the individual entirely into the collective, treating the good of the city as the only good and the person as simply a contributor to it. This, too, misunderstood something important. The Nicomachean Ethics was, in the end, a book about how a particular person could live well, how the individual could organize the whole of their life around the genuine exercise of their best capacities in friendship and community, in contemplative activity and practical engagement alike. The polis was not the end point, it was the form of life within which the end point, the individual's full and active flourishing, became possible. He walked slowly through the quiet streets, not yet ready to return to the Lyceum. The night had the quality that long evenings sometimes arrive at, a certain spaciousness, a slight loosening of the urgency that drives most of the daytime hours, as if the darkness had given things a little room to breathe. He thought about the two men at the symposium, their particular quality of mutual attention, the way they had sat in silence at the end without needing to fill it. Whatever account of the good life he was trying to complete, they were somewhere in it, not as examples to be cited, but as evidence of the kind of thing that was actually available to human beings who happened to find each other and take each other seriously over time. He had written somewhere, he could not remember the exact formulation, that without friends, no one would choose to live, even if they had every other good. At the time of writing it, the claim had felt slightly strong, slightly more assertive than the evidence strictly required. But standing in the quiet street with the symposium behind him and the Lyceum's lamplight faint in the distance ahead, it felt not only true, but obvious. The pleasures of solitary thought were real. The satisfaction of careful work done well was real. The equanimity that comes from having one's character settled around reliable dispositions was real. But all of these goods, however genuinely they deserved their name, existed within a texture of human life that included other people, not as ornaments or utilities or sources of occasional pleasure, but as the relational medium within which a human being becomes, over time, the particular human being they are. Because the friend, the genuine friend, is one of the means by which a person comes to know themselves, not through anything so dramatic as revelation or crisis, but through the ordinary slow process of being genuinely seen by someone who cares about what they see. Being known, actually known, in the particular and unhurried way that genuine friendship makes possible, is one of the conditions under which a person can do the harder work of becoming more fully themselves. The friend's honest attention is a kind of mirror, but not a flattering one. It reflects what is actually there, including what is still unrealized, and the person who has such a friend has something that wealth cannot purchase and reputation cannot substitute for. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a brief sound that settled back into silence almost immediately. He turned a corner, and the Lyceum gates came into view ahead of him, the stones still faintly warm from the day's heat. He had a lecture in the morning on the soul, or possibly on rhetoric. He could not immediately remember which, and there were students who would arrive early and have questions they had been holding since the previous session, waiting for the right moment to ask them. He found he was not tired. The evening had left him with the particular quality of alertness that good conversation sometimes produces, a sense of the mind having been genuinely used and genuinely enriched rather than merely busy. Inside the Lyceum, past the entrance court and the garden with its low night-flowering plants, the library held its accumulated contents in the quiet of the late hour. Scrolls on their wooden racks, anatomical diagrams, the careful drawings of marine organisms that the student from Asia Minor had brought back, still lying flat on the table where they had been examined, pressed specimens in their shallow boxes, a set of notes from last season's lectures on the constitutions of Greek cities, annotated in several different hands, his own and the hands of students who had worked through the arguments alongside him, adding corrections and questions, and occasional disagreements in the margins. He stood in the doorway of the library for a moment, without entering, looking at all of this in the lamplight. The books and specimens and notes had been gathered by many people over many years. Some of the contributors were no longer in Athens, some were gone in other ways. But what they had added to this room, the observations they had made, the arguments they had advanced, the questions they had posed clearly enough that later thinking could continue them, remained here, available to anyone who came to the room with genuine attention and the patience to engage with what had been left. He stepped inside. The air in the library had a particular quality that he had noticed over the years without quite being able to explain it, something about the dry smell of old papyrus and the faint residual warmth of many hours of concentrated human presence. He moved to his usual table near the window that faced the garden and sat down not to work exactly, but to be here for a while. The question of friendship and the polis, and their relationship to the individual's good, had not been fully resolved tonight, and probably would not be resolved in any single evening or any single text. It was the kind of question that accumulated its answer gradually, through many conversations and many observations and many careful returns to the argument, when new evidence or a genuinely challenging objection required it, and that accumulation was itself a form of community. Not only the community of the people who are currently alive and working together in this building, but the wider and longer community of everyone who had thought carefully about these questions before and left their thinking in a form that later thinkers could encounter. The Lyceum's library was in this sense a kind of extended philia, a set of relationships organized around a shared care for what is actually true, maintained across time and distance by the medium of written thought. He was not alone in this room, even at this hour. The people who had thought before him were present in the text they had left, and the people who would think after him would encounter what was being worked out here, in this building, in these years, long after the particular people working it out were gone. He sat for a while without reading, his hand resting on the edge of the table. Through the window, the garden was dark, except for the thin light of a small lamp on a post near the path. The low night-flowering plants were faintly visible, and somewhere in the branches of the nearest tree, a bird had settled into sleep, shifting occasionally with a small sound that carried through the still air and then was absorbed back into silence. He thought about the evening, the symposium, and the careful watching, the two men and their quality of mutual attention, the walk home through the quiet streets. He thought about the student whose observations had required a revision of a previous claim. He thought about the constitutions of cities and the question of what form of life a city exists in order to make possible. The best life, he had written, is not lived in isolation, not because solitude has no genuine goods, it has several, and he respected them, but because the fullest exercise of the capacities that distinguish human beings requires other people, people who can be genuinely cared for, people who can genuinely care in return, people who share the slow project of building a form of life together in which courage and justice and generosity can actually exist as practiced realities rather than as theoretical virtues, waiting for conditions that never arrive. The polis is not a constraint on this life. It is the medium in which this life becomes possible. He reached out and moved the lamp slightly closer, not to read but simply to have the light near. Outside, Athens continued its late-night sounds, distant, intermittent, belonging to the city's own ongoing life, which did not require his attention or anyone else's to continue. The Lyceum Library held its books and specimens and notes in the quiet of the hour, gathered by many hands, available to many more. Whatever any single person had contributed to this room, the observations, the arguments, the careful questions, had passed into something that belonged to no one in particular, and to everyone who came to it honestly. That too was a form of the city, not the city of laws and assemblies and citizenship defined by birth, though that city mattered enormously, and its health was not separable from the health of the people who lived in it. But the wider form of the city, the community of shared inquiry and mutual concern and patient attention to what is actually true, maintained across years and persons and distances by the ongoing practice of thinking together, carefully, without the need for drama or urgency or the forced resolution of questions that are genuinely still open. He sat a little longer in the lamplight, his hand on the table, the garden dark beyond the window, the city quiet around the building's walls, the bird in the tree shifting once more, and then settling back into its small and complete sleep. The lamp in the Lyceum had been burning for a long time. Outside, the city had grown quiet in the way cities do in the deep middle of the night. Not silent exactly, but stilled, the ordinary noise of commerce and argument, and wheel on stone, all drawn back into the darkness from which it came each morning. Inside, Aristotle sat with a question. Not a question he expected to answer tonight. Not a question, perhaps, that answering was the proper relationship to. The lamp held its small circle of warm light. The rest of the room gathered into shadow around it, and in that shadow, on the low shelves that lined the walls, the accumulated evidence of 30 years of patient inquiry rested in its various forms, bones and shells, and pressed botanical specimens and scrolls, whose margins were filled with the close, careful notation of a mind that had never found a phenomenon too small to notice. He had spent most of his life working in the middle range of things, the practical virtues, the structure of argument, the classification of animals, the qualities that made a city capable of justice. These had occupied him with a kind of workmanlike devotion that was itself, he believed, a form of flourishing, the mind moving steadily through the world, measuring and recording, and asking what each thing was for. But now, in the last pages of the work his students had come to call the Nicomachean Ethics, he made a deliberate shift. The argument about practical virtue had been made, as carefully as he could make it, and something in him turned, the way a person turns at the end of a long walk through productive country, toward something higher and quieter. He was turning toward the Thoria. The word is difficult to carry across so many centuries and into so different a world. It is sometimes translated as contemplation, sometimes as philosophical inquiry, but neither word quite holds what Aristotle meant, which was something closer to the activity of the mind in its freest and most complete engagement with what is most real, not solving, not producing, not arguing toward a conclusion that could then be put to use, but simply attending with full and unhurried intelligence to the deep structure of things. The objects of the Thoria, as he understood them, were the unchanging truths that lay beneath the variable surface of the natural world, the principles of mathematics, the questions of first philosophy, the structure of being itself. These could not be harvested or traded or shaped into anything useful. They were what they were, entirely and only, and the activity of turning a trained mind toward them was its own complete justification. This was not a retreat from the world he had spent his career examining. It was, in some sense, the world's own depth becoming visible, the same patient attention he had brought to the tidal shallows on Lesbos, notebook in hand, recording the feeding habits of cephalopods, with the seriousness other men reserved for war, was now turned inward and upward toward the question of what moved beneath all motion, what held beneath all change. The shift in register was real, but the quality of attention was the same, careful, honest, unhurried, grounded in the conviction that what is actually there will reward looking. Outside the lamp's circle, Athens went on sleeping. The question that Aristotle was holding, the question of the first mover, of the ground beneath the visible world, had no practical issue. It would not help a general win a battle or a merchant calculate a fair price. He had said as much and had meant it as a distinction of the highest kind. The activity of inquiry pursued entirely for its own sake, with no goal beyond the inquiry itself, was, in his considered view, the finest thing a human being could do with the time given to them. Not because practical life was unworthy. He had spent 9 complete books arguing for its texture and dignity, but because this was the one activity in which the most distinctively human capacity was most fully expressed, the capacity to think, carefully and freely, and without compulsion, about what is most real. There is a figure in the 12th book of the Metaphysics that Aristotle set down with a kind of hushed precision. He called it the unmoved mover. The phrase sounds in translation like a theological claim of the loud sort that demands assent or resistance. It was neither. It was a philosophical inference. If motion exists, something must have initiated it without itself being set in motion by something else. But what occupied Aristotle most was not the logical structure of this inference. It was what the unmoved mover was doing, and what it was doing was thinking. Specifically, and here the phrase becomes strange and beautiful, it was engaged in noesis, noesios, thinking itself, pure thought, whose object was its own activity. No tool, no product, no labor toward an end. Only the complete and self-sustaining act of a mind fully at work on the thing it was most suited to attend to. Aristotle did not believe that human beings could sustain this permanently. the body and its needs, the social world and its claims, the daily texture of practical life. All of these were real and irreducible, and a person who dismissed them in pursuit of pure contemplation would not become divine, but would simply cease to function well as a human being. He was clear about this. The argument for the contemplative life was never an argument for withdrawal from practical virtue or civic participation or genuine friendship. It was an argument about what, within the full and richly inhabited human life, most completely expressed the best of what a human being could be. When he wrote, in one of the most direct sentences in the Nicomachean Ethics, that his readers should not listen to those who urged them to think only human thoughts because they were human, that they should strive, insofar as it was possible, to live in accordance with the highest element within themselves. He was not pointing toward transcendence. He was pointing toward depth. The divine element within the human was not a separate self waiting to escape the body. It was the capacity for sustained, careful, freely chosen thought, the capacity that was already present and already active in every honest inquiry, every followed argument, every question held with patience through the dark. The lamp held its circle. The question about the first mover remained open, as these questions do, not because Aristotle had failed to think it through, but because the question was genuinely that kind of question, one whose depth was not a problem to be solved, but a territory to be inhabited over a long and careful life. He had written elsewhere that the person who cannot live in community must be either a beast or a god. The philosopher, he believed, was neither. The philosopher was a human being fully at work, embedded in a city and a history and a web of friendships, and also in possession of a capacity that touched something beyond the immediate social world, the capacity to sit with a question about the structure of being and find in that sitting that still and patient attendance, not restlessness, but something close to rest. This is where the scholarly puzzle lives, and where it is most honest to let it rest without forcing it closed. For 9 books, Aristotle had built a portrait of eudaimonia that was emphatically plural and embedded, requiring virtuous action in a civic context, genuine friendship, material sufficiency, and the exercise of practical wisdom in the fluid particulars of actual life. Happiness, as he had argued it, was something one did rather than something one had. It required others. It required institutions. It required the kind of sustained moral practice that could only occur within a community organized around shared conceptions of justice. And then, in the 10th and final book, he turned and suggested that the highest happiness was something else, the philosopher alone with the unchanging objects of pure thought, needing very little, self-sufficient, in the way the divine was self-sufficient, in the way the divine was self-sufficient, as close to complete in the activity of contemplation as an embodied and social creature could come. Scholars have argued for centuries about whether these two visions, the practically virtuous person woven into civic life and the philosopher absorbed in the thoria, are genuinely in conflict. Some have read the contemplative ideal as Aristotle's true final answer, with the preceding 9 books as merely a preliminary account for those not capable of philosophy's highest register. Others have read the 2 lives as genuinely complementary, the contemplative life available only to one who has already inhabited the practical virtues with full seriousness, and whose civic and social flourishing provides the stable ground from which the philosophical life can be lived. No one has settled this. The question is still being turned over carefully, as Aristotle himself would have wished, by people who find in the turning a form of the very activity he was describing. What is clear is that neither vision was, for Aristotle, a vision of escape. The practically virtuous person was not fleeing the difficulty of contemplation by staying embedded in social life. The philosopher was not fleeing the difficulty of civic engagement by retreating into pure thought. Both were engaged, fully, honestly, with the best of their capacity, in something that counted as being at work in the truest sense. Energia, continuous being at work. Actuality, not mere potentiality. The verb form, not the noun. This was what he had meant, all along, by happiness, not a state to be achieved and then rested in, but an activity sustained over a whole life, across its easier and harder seasons alike. In the still of the Lyceum, the lamp went on burning. The bones and shells and pressed plants on the shelves were quiet, in the way objects are quiet when the work that gathered them is finished for the day. And the question Aristotle was holding, about first causes, about divine thought, about the deepest structure of what is real, rested in the room with the same undemanding patience it would rest in every room where someone sat honestly with it, across all the centuries that followed. There is a word Aristotle used for the particular quality of time that made this kind of inquiry possible. The word was skol. It is usually translated as leisure, but that translation loses something important. Skol was not idleness. It was not the recovery of a tired body or the numbing comfort of amusement after labor. It was the condition of genuine freedom from necessity, time, and attention, liberated from the compulsory world of production and survival, and turned entirely toward activities pursued for no reason beyond their own intrinsic worth. The philosopher following an argument wherever it led, regardless of where it arrived. The mathematician absorbed in a proof that would never be used to measure a field or calculate a tax. The person sitting quietly with the fact of existence, attending to the particular texture of this moment, this light, this particular quality of stillness, these were all, in Aristotle's understanding, forms of skol, and skol was, for him, not a luxury to be earned by the completion of necessary work, but the register within which the highest human capacities could be most fully expressed. He had been careful to distinguish this from mere amusement. Amusement was restorative. It let a person recover from labor so that they could return to labor again. It was not, therefore, an end in itself, but a means, just as the meal was a means to the body's continued capacity for work. Skol was different. The mathematician was not recovering. The philosopher was not resting in preparation for something else. They were, in the activity itself, doing the thing that the capacity for rational inquiry was for. The activity and its own full expression were the same thing, and this was why Aristotle could say, without apparent paradox, that the philosopher sitting quietly with a question about being was, in that sitting, more completely at work than the general directing a battle, or the merchant overseeing a trade, because the philosopher's activity was entirely what it was for, while the general's and the merchant's activities were always in service of something beyond themselves. This distinction held a kind of peace in it, not the peace of having finished, or of having nothing left to do, the peace of being exactly where one's nature was most fully expressed, in an activity that required nothing beyond itself to justify it. The way a bird's flight is its own justification, not a means to the bird's next resting place, but the thing the bird's form was built for, happening completely and cleanly in the air. Outside the Lyceum, the night was very deep. Athens had long since passed the hour when even its philosophers kept their lamps lit. But Aristotle was not aware of the time in the way a person is aware of time when they are waiting for something. He was simply present in the question, in the room, in the still activity of a mind that had spent 40 years learning how to remain honestly with difficulty without converting it into drama. This quality of presence, not forced, not performed, simply the natural consequence of a long habit of honest attention, was itself one of the things he had been trying to describe throughout the entire 10 books. The eudaimon person was not someone who had found the answer. They were someone who had learned to inhabit the question with the whole of themselves. The image of the unmoved mover comes back here in a way that is not theological, but almost domestic, a being entirely absorbed in the activity of pure thought, not reaching, not striving, not moving toward a goal that lay outside the activity itself, simply thinking in the way a flame is simply burning, complete in each moment, requiring nothing beyond the continuation of what it already is. Aristotle did not claim that human beings could permanently inhabit this condition, but he did claim that something in them could approximate it, the same quality of absorbed, self-sustaining engagement that was available in the thoria, in genuine skull, in the activity of the mind fully at work on the objects it was most suited to attend to. And what moved the world, in his theology, was not commandment or creation. The unmoved mover moved things the way beauty moved a person toward it, without effort, without reaching, simply by being what it was, completely and without remainder. Everything that moved in the cosmos moved toward this still center, the way attention moves toward something genuinely worth attending to, not because it has been instructed to, but because the quality of the thing draws it, quietly and without compulsion, in the direction of its own deepest capacity. There is a tenderness in this image that the theological vocabulary tends to obscure. What Aristotle was describing was not a ruler or a lawgiver or a creator. It was more like the experience of sitting with something genuinely beautiful, a proof, or a particular quality of evening light, or the specific texture of a question that has been carried long enough to lose its urgency and become simply itself, and feeling the attention settle, without effort, into something that does not require it to be anything other than what it already is. He had argued, throughout the Nicomachean Ethics, that happiness was something a human being did rather than something they possessed, that it was a form of being at work, continuous and expressed across a whole life, that it required the active exercise of the best human capacities in the service of genuine goods, courage, justice, generosity, practical wisdom, and the friendship in which care for one's own flourishing and care for another's became indistinguishable. All of that stood. None of it was being retracted in the turn toward the thoria, but here, in the final movement of the argument, something additional was being named, something that had always been available within the life that included all those active virtues, a quality of still, self-sustaining engagement with what was most real, an activity that needed nothing beyond itself to justify it, a form of being fully at work that was also, in its depth and stillness, a form of rest. The question of how these two visions of flourishing, the active and the contemplative, were ultimately related was one Aristotle left open, and this openness was not carelessness. It was philosophical honesty of a specific kind. The life of practical virtue and civic participation and genuine friendship was real and good, and largely available to any person willing to cultivate the relevant dispositions with sufficient patience and consistency over time. The life of the thoria, in its fullest expression, was available only to those whose circumstances and capacities permitted the sustained, unhurried engagement with the deepest questions. Not everyone, not always, not in equal measure, but the quality of attention that characterized the thoria, the absorbed, self-sufficient, non-instrumental quality of a mind fully at work on the things it was most suited to engage with, That quality was not exclusively the property of the philosopher. It was available in smaller and less sustained forms in any genuine act of attention, in any moment when the mind, freed briefly from the pressure of the merely urgent, turned towards something worth attending to for its own sake, and found in that turning a kind of stillness. This is what Aristotle was sitting with, in the lamp's small circle as the night deepened around him. Not a problem to be solved, but a question to be carried. Not an argument to be concluded, but a territory to be inhabited, slowly and with care, over the long, unhurried arc of a life. The bones and shells on the shelves, each one a record of patient attention paid to the actual texture of living things, were quiet around him. The pressed plants had long since dried into something permanent and light. The scrolls in their clay cases held the arguments of years, waiting, as good arguments do, to be taken up again by whoever came next, with sufficient patience and honesty to follow them where they went. The lamp's flame held very still. The oil fed it steadily, without decision. The light it made was warm and small, and entirely sufficient for what was being done within it. A mind present to itself, a question held openly, a life that was, in this particular moment, as in all the others, still at work. What Aristotle had built over the course of the Nicomachean Ethics was not a system in the sense of something complete and closed. It was more like a set of sustained inquiries that had been pursued with enough patience to reveal their own natural shape. The shape was not a pyramid with a single peak. It was more like a landscape, varied, internally consistent, with different elevations suited to different conditions of inquiry. The practical virtues occupied the broad middle ground where most of human life was lived. Friendship and civic participation filled the valleys where the soil was richest, and theoria occupied something closer to the high ground, not above practical life in the sense of escaping it, but offering from its particular elevation a view of the whole that was only available to someone who had also inhabited the lower ground with full seriousness and care. The person who had cultivated genuine courage over years of small, honest engagements with danger, who had practiced justice in the daily texture of their relations with others, who had formed the kind of friendship in which another person's flourishing was genuinely inseparable from their own. That person was not leaving anything behind when they turned, in a moment of genuine skull, toward the deep questions. They were bringing everything they had built, quietly and without drama, to the place where the best use of it could be made. The virtues were not a staircase to be climbed and abandoned. They were the ground from which everything else grew. This is perhaps the most quiet and least dramatic of all Aristotle's claims, and for that reason it is also the one most easily missed. Flourishing was not a destination. It was not a peak to be reached and then inhabited. It was the quality of a life as it was actually being lived, in the courage of an honest engagement with fear, in the justice of returning what belonged to another, in the generosity of genuine care, in the friendship that made another's good indistinguishable from one's own, and in the moments of skull when the mind, freed from necessity, turned towards something worth attending to, simply because it was there and worth attending to. The season, as he had said, required duration. One swallow did not make a spring. The warmth of a single excellent day did not constitute the warmth of a life well lived. But the season was real, and one inhabited it by living within it, consistently, patiently, over the whole arc of years, rather than by arriving at it once and declaring the journey complete. Outside, Athens was as quiet as it would get before the early light began. In the Lyceum's garden, the path where Aristotle walked with his students in the morning was dark now, the grove of trees that lined it, barely visible against the deeper dark of the sky. In a few hours, the path would be walked again, and the questions that had been carried through it over years would be carried through it again, some of them the same questions Aristotle had brought to Plato as a young man, some of them newer, some of them old, in the way that only the genuinely hard questions are old, present in every era because they belong to the structure of the inquiry rather than to the historical circumstances that occasion it. The lamp inside was still burning. The flame moved only slightly in the still air. The small fluctuations of a thing that is fully sustained and needs very little to continue. The light it made fell on the bones and shells and dried plants with an evenness that asked nothing from them. They were simply there, as evidence of the long patient work of paying attention, gathered from the actual world by hands that had also, in their time, held pens and turned pages and rested in stillness against the edge of a wooden table, while a mind followed an argument into whatever depth it went. There is a particular quality of stillness that settles over a room where serious thinking has been done and is now for the moment resting, not the stillness of emptiness, not the stillness of completion, the stillness of something ongoing, held temporarily in a state of low activity, the way a fire is held in its coals, the capacity fully present, the expression quietly banked, waiting without urgency for the conditions of its next full expression. The room in the Lyceum had that quality. The shelves had it. The question that Aristotle had been holding, which was now settling slowly back into the deep ground of his long engagement with it, had it. He was not, in this moment, solving anything. He was not, in this moment, building anything. He was in the condition that all the careful work had been moving toward, not triumphantly, not as a destination finally reached, but quietly, the way a long day of walking eventually becomes evening, the body settling into its natural rhythm of rest, without deciding to, the mind releasing its hold on the day's specific demands and opening gradually into the wider and less particular country of whatever remained when the work was done. The breath moved through him steadily. The lamp moved very slightly.